Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. My name is Ben Dubose. I'm your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets, joined by my good friend, co-host, and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves. You can follow him on Twitter at Paulo Alves NBA and consume his content there. I'm on Twitter as well at Ben Dubose. And we're recording this episode on Monday night, April 3rd, the night of the NCAA National Championship game in men's basketball, conveniently in Houston. But it's a good time for us to record and talk about the Rockets and the NBA because every year the NBA takes the night off for the college basketball national championship game. So because of that, basically what we talk about in terms of the outlook for the next week, the final week of the NBA's 2022 to 23 regular season, it's not going to get outdated by the time you listen to this podcast. There will at least be a few hours that what we say is completely timely because we're going to be able to release this before there's games that change out the outlook as far as the Rockets and their draft picks. That's going to be a big part of our discussion because these final games, both for the Rockets' own pick and especially for the pick that's going to be headed their way in all likelihood from the LA Clippers, the pick swap right they obtained in the Eric Gordon trade to the deadline. There's a ton of variance depending on how the season finishes for the Clippers. That could be as high as 13, 14, conceivably they could fall to play-in range and miss the playoffs, or if things go well for them, they could still somehow get up to 20 or 21, or down to 20 or 21, I should say. So a lot of variance. We're going to go into those scenarios. We're also going to be talking about the last few games for the Rockets. They won Friday against Detroit at home, promptly got blown out by the Lakers on Sunday, really struggled to match up with Anthony Davis. The home finale is Tuesday night against Denver, followed by the final two games of the season on the road at Charlotte and Washington this weekend. So we're going to talk about the micro of what's been going on the last few games, what to watch for over the final three, both in terms of the draft pick and then, well, what to look for on the floor as the season winds down and we get a few more games to evaluate this young core, guys like Jalen Green, Kevin Porter Jr., Alperen Sengun, Jabari Smith Jr., and so on and so forth. And then we're also going to talk a bit about the macro in terms of what comes next, because a week from now, the season is going to be over for the Rockets. And so they're going to do a full evaluation as they do every year of their entire basketball operations staff. Certainly it'll start with general manager Rafael Stone. My expectation is that he stays, but crazier things have happened. Head coach Stephen Silas after that. I think there's definitely some skepticism over whether he returns. He's in the last fully guaranteed year of his contract, according to reports. We've talked about that in our archives, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the day-to-day because once the season ends on Sunday in Washington, the Rockets are going to have to make some of these decisions relatively quickly because they've got to pivot to off-season mode as they start getting into the draft prep process, more scouting, getting ready for the NBA Combine, the draft lottery, the draft in June, and then a very heavy transaction window in late June, early July to start free agency. Rockets positioned to have, give or take, about $60 million in cap room. So they need to have their ducks in a row when it comes to the leadership and who's going to stay or not stay. And if someone doesn't stay, then who do you bring in to replace those guys? We've heard some rumors lately about coaches, potentially Nick Nurse of Toronto, Ime Udoka with the Celtics a year ago, Frank Vogel recently of the Lakers as potential targets for the Rockets. We're going to get into all of that on today's show, and we're going to bounce around a bit because I don't want to make it too linear in terms of the timeline. Honestly, a lot of what's happening on the court right now, we can sort of have a broader discussion about how to potentially fix it and where some of these names might come into play. So as usual, if you listen to us here at the Lager Line, we bounce around a lot. And so that's what we're going to be doing today, going back and forth between the recent games, the draft pick outlook over the remaining 3 or 4 games across the association as it pertains to the Rockets, and then, of course, getting you prepped for the start of the offseason. One more housekeeping note off the top. I have not forgotten the new NBA collective bargaining agreement that was reached over the weekend. Kudos to Adam Silver and the league office, along with the players union, for coming to a consensus that's going to avoid losing any games, unlike Major League Baseball a year ago. Well, I guess MLB didn't lose games, but it was, boy, an ugly lockout, and it delayed the start of the season. NBA is not going to have that, so there's going to be continuity in terms of basketball. In terms of the implications, we're actually working on a special show for that and got a guest to help us break down what the key implications are, not just for the league, but for the Rockets in particular. We're going to hold that until later in the week, trying to get clarity on a couple more details. If you want to look at the preliminaries, I just released or recorded, I think it's about to be released, an episode of Locked on Rockets with Jackson Gatlin talking about some of the preliminary details of the CBA and what its implications are. But for more in-depth coverage, which is what we do here at the Logger Line, we'll have that in a few days. Stay tuned. We're working on a good guest that will help illustrate, I think, really what this means for the Rockets and the key takeaways that you as a Rockets fan and consumer should have when you look at the CBA and what it's likely to mean for the Rockets and their rebuild and hopefully their transition back to winning and back to title contention over the next few years. Okay, now that we've set this up, Paolo, what have you noticed on the floor the last few games? I think even though they lost and it was the final game of a 7-game losing streak, I feel like the most positive signs were really that game last Wednesday in Brooklyn, where I thought the Rockets looked really good and they led for a lot of the game. Quite frankly, it took the Nets just going on an insane 3-point barrage late in that game to steal it at the very end. But I thought they looked together. I thought defensively they were organized. I think across the board, your guards, Şengün and Jabari, both had double doubles. Everybody contributed. Jalen and KPJ did their thing. Well, I think it was an off game for Jalen, but other than that, KPJ and then the front court of Şengün and Jabari, it was good for them. Friday, you won against Detroit, but it was hard to get very excited about that game. I thought, really, if not for Jalen and KPJ combining for 65 points on strong efficiency, the Rockets probably lose that game at home to the worst team in the league by record. It was a very uninspiring defensive effort. It took Jalen and KPJ both being in A-plus mode, at least offensively, for the Rockets to get that win. And then the same, I would say, defensive lethargy carried over to the Sunday game against the Lakers, and that was pretty much uncompetitive, lost by 25. Makes sense because, again, the Lakers with LeBron and Anthony Davis, they're better anyway. They're veteran-laden. They're also playing for playoff positioning and trying to lock down a spot, whereas the Rockets have long been eliminated. So it's a scheduled loss to begin with, but I do think it sort of continued a trend that after we saw a couple of weeks ago, the defense picking up a little bit during that stretch where they won 3 straight games and 5 of 8. It felt like they lost a little bit of confidence on that road trip against contenders. And other than the finish against Brooklyn and I suppose the first game against Memphis, it feels like we've seen the intensity wane a little bit. I know they got the win against Detroit, but that was basically just because of insane shot making by KPJ and Jalen. Generally speaking, other than some individual bright spots like that, I feel like that the defensive effort has slipped a lot. And so that's what's, I guess, been my big takeaway. It feels like on some level, this team, this staff, whoever you want to attribute it to, is ready for the offseason, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's different depending on which player you're talking about. I don't think Kevin Green's defense has actually slowed down that much. I think he's been one of our most consistent performers on that end, at least compared to earlier in the season where he was literally one of the worst defenders in the league. Listen, at this point in the season, once you start losing again after that losing streak, you might as well go all the way and lose completely. There's 3 games left. Just make sure you stay below the Spurs. Although I kind of have a conspiracy theory that whenever the Rockets tie the Spurs, they somehow win a game, which makes me suspicious that the third pick's the one that's jumping up and they know something. Joking, of course. But yeah, I think there's some positive trends and some negative trends that you can look at. I think Therese and just the hustle's still there. I don't think he's been defending great. He's back to his ways of tunnel visioning when he gets offensive rebounds. He's back to just being extremely inefficient around the basket after showing some flashes of being better earlier in the season. It's kind of disappointing with him, but I think it's something that he can work on. He's just a rookie. These are all mentality type things and experience type things that he can work on. The moment he's able to read that he's not 7 foot and a contested layup is more than likely not going to be better than a kick out to an open shooter, it's going to do great things for this team, and I think he's not far away from it at all. Jabari Smith Jr.'s shot has regressed all the way back over the last 10 games. He's shooting 28% from three again. Let's just hope that in the offseason they can work on it. I have no clue at this point. I don't know if it. We seem to notice a higher arc before. He seems to be shooting better from or shooting well still from the mid-range area and getting more reps in at that. But the 3-point shot it's gone way back down again. More footnotes about the last few games. Well, it seems that I've cursed Jalen Green's free throws on the podcast.
Ever since this podcast, our last episode, yeah.
Yeah, so he was perfect over the 3 games before, and then he missed one, he missed 2, he missed 5, he missed 6 free throws until last game where he went 8 of 8. And I want to shout out, and I hopefully I don't butcher his name, Manav Gupta, who
I believe
talked
that's right,
to Jalen, who talked to Jalen Green, and Jalen promised him that he'd make all of his free throws. I'm not quite sure if it was next game or until the end of the season. Hopefully until the end of the season. But truth is, he came back and he made 8 of 8 against the Los Angeles Lakers. It's, on a side note, kind of sad that it was only 8, considering he was getting hacked on every attempt at the rim. They were calling it blocks, but I mean, it's not just about getting the ball. It's about not hitting the player while you get the ball. But yeah. So from Jalen Green's perspective, that, and since we last recorded the podcast, Jalen has had an average of 5 assists a game to only 1.8 turnovers. I think that's noticeable when you watch him play. I think his handle's better. I think he's making smarter decisions even if his shot's not falling. Let's hope he can transition that into next season. One last trend, or two more. Josh Christopher is he has some skill, right? He has a skill set that we don't really have, which is the ability to finish at the rim through contact. Jalen sucks at it. KPJ sucks at it. Everybody sucks at it, besides Sengun, I guess. But that's basically all that is there at this point. He still can shoot. He has a mid-range game, right? But you're not gonna, out of what's projected to be a role player, you're not going to rely on the mid-range game for him to be effective. He still oversells on defense. He still overestimates how quick he can move his feet. It's kind of sad. He was one of my favorite players. I love him as a human being. It's kind of sad about him. And the last thing I was going to touch on to leave on a brighter note, these last few games footnotes. KJ Martin over the last 10 games is shooting 37% from 3 on 3 attempts, 77% from the line. Great development. He's at 31% for the season. At this point, you're never going to change that much. It's way too late. But it's still a good trajectory to go on, because he was a better shooter both his rookie year and last year. And it's very important to his game that he can, be at least a 36% shooter. And I will give him credit because the percentage is lower, but I wouldn't necessarily say that he's shooting worse. It's just that he's more willing to take the shots, and that's important as well. That's an important part of the progress towards becoming a 3-and-D wing, is being willing to take the shots with a little bit less space sometimes, because that's what the offense expects you to do. And if he can combine that new willingness to shoot with more efficiency that he's shown the last few games, it'll be really good moving forward, regardless of if the Rockets just take his player option next year or extend them or decline it and make him a restricted free agent and then extend them.
So I've got a couple of trends, one good, one bad, that I want to touch on before we move on to the next week and talking about the draft pick outlook, both for the Rockets and the pick they're most likely going to get from the Clippers. The good, at least statistically, Kevin Porter Jr. has been out of this world. The 2 home games over the weekend, 7 of 13 from 3, 6 of 10 from 3. Over his last 7 games, he's shooting 46% from 3. For the season as a whole now, he's over 40, for the season as a whole, he's over 36% from 3 and 56% from, or his true shooting percentage. And if you go back a little bit further, he had the slow start to the season. Since Christmas, now that's not quite as long as it might sound. It's 26 games because, of course, he missed about 7 weeks with the toe injury. But in 26 games since Christmas, his true shooting percentage is 60.3. And he's shooting 41% from 3 over that time period on a volume of more than 7 per game. He's averaging 5.9 assists to just 2.4 turnovers over that period. This is a really good and really efficient offensive guard for a sustained period of time. And that's the type of production that, at least numerically, is a bargain compared to the contract you got him on before the season. Now, I know there's extenuating circumstances with Kevin Porter Jr. There's always going to be with regards to, the off-court concerns that defined his early seasons in the NBA. We can talk about, is he a point guard or not? But I think what this stretch to me really underscores is that there is a very talented player in there who's just 22 years old. And while he's not at the level of Jalen Green, Jabari Smith, even Alperen Şengün, in my opinion, in terms of importance to your future, he is someone that, on a very team-friendly and controlled deal, if things break right, could absolutely be a very valuable role player for you, a Jamal Crawford type for this next generation of NBA basketball, even if he's not a point guard. And you can certainly point out that even though the turnovers have dropped, assists have relatively held steady. You can point out that, look, his processing speed is still not great. Defensively, the lapses are there. I'm not trying to say that just because the stats are there that all of a sudden he's a great player. No, I'm not saying that. But what I do think they underscore is there's a very talented player who's 6'6", athletic, can guard a lot of positions, is just 22 years old. There's a very talented piece if you can use him in the right way and get him to accept the role. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I would love to see it work with KPJ. I think it'd be a feel-good story if somehow the Rockets could salvage his career after the way things looked at the end of his Cleveland stint. I think it'd be, great for Kevin to figure this out, and for the Rockets, it would only benefit them to have a player on just a very team-friendly contract that can slot into a number of roles. It could give you a lot of flexibility moving forward. And I think one reason why KPJ hasn't always gotten his flowers on social media or the blogs, certainly there's always been something of a lightning rod component to KPJ. You either love him or you hate him, it feels like. And so I think some people just don't want to talk about KPJ because they don't want everything that accompanies it. So you just sort of, I guess, bite your tongue on social media. I felt like that at times, I'll be completely honest. Another part of it, though, is that even the good moments, they're sort of tempered by this idea of, well, where does he fit in the long-term picture? In that, even if he's a talented player, he's probably not the point guard. So does he really fit long term, especially if you're not convinced he would accept another role? Well, there's a couple of things as I've been thinking about, and I'll admit I'm squinting harder. I'm trying to find a way to fit KPJ in this puzzle because he's a fantastic shooter. And if you can find a way to get the best out of KPJ, he can absolutely contribute, in my opinion, to a good NBA team. There's a couple of things. First off, even if he's the point guard in name, if you actually watch the Rockets, you know that in this period, especially since Christmas, we've seen Jalen Green taking on more and more playmaking responsibility. So even if KPJ is the point guard in name, I suspect if you dive into the data, and perhaps I should have done it before this podcast, I actually haven't. I don't think he's dribbling the ball in terms of the time of the possession nearly to the extent that he's done at times in the past. I think he is being a bit more deferential as we've seen Jalen Green take on a bit more playmaking responsibility as his second season has progressed. So I think we're already seeing him take something of a step back. And as you've made this point in the past, Paolo, it's something that should be, if he accepts the role, pretty seamless because we know how elite of a catch and shoot guy that Kevin Porter Jr. can be. Secondly, I do think it's important to note a lot of people worry about would Kevin Porter Jr. accept not being a point guard because, of course, it's been his team the last couple of years. Would he give up the keys? I think most people agree that if it was James Harden, given a guy that's a certain Hall of Famer, I think he'd do it gracefully for James. In other scenarios, if there's more of a question. The one thing I'll note, it's not as if Kevin Porter Jr. demanded to be the starter at point guard. Let's talk about how we actually went down this road. It was the Rockets that determined that John Wall in the summer of 2021 didn't really make sense for the rebuild that they were going into these next couple of years. And, I'm sure some can wink, wink and say, the tank they were about to embark upon as well, because of course veterans can be prohibitive to that. Although we should point out John was definitely not prohibitive to that his first season in Houston. Look, Kevin Porter Jr. was simply the best option they had to fill those point guard reps. The Rockets and Rafael Stone had seen what he could do. And, he had, of course, the 50-point, 10 assist game at the end of the 2020 to 2021 season. And so it was something of an experiment. It wasn't as if the Rockets traded for Kevin Porter Jr., drafted him at a high spot and said, you are our point guard. No, this was always something of the team's going to be bad anyway, so let's just see what we've got here and how this turns out. It was not a lifelong commitment. There was never a point in which you said Kevin Porter Jr. is the point guard of the future. It was never like that. It just sort of happened that he was the best option. And like any player that has pride, you're not going to say, well, I don't believe I can do this. No, you've got to take the bull by the horns, and that's what he's done, saying, hey, I'm the point guard, I'm the leader, this is my job, and he's tried to do it, I believe, to the best of his ability. And, he's certainly not a perfect player, but I believe he's absolutely taken it seriously. But where I think the initial expectations are important, again, it's not like Kevin Porter Jr. went into Rafael Stone's office, at least not to my knowledge, and said, make me the point guard. I want this. And the contract the Rockets got him on with so many team options, it's not as if they've given him the keys and said, this is your franchise. There's pretty clearly a lot of uncertainty, and there always was, with where Kevin Porter Jr. fits in and does he fit in. So because of that, I'm not going to say I expect him to automatically take a 6-man role, a wing role, whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to say that maybe there's a better case than the conventional narrative would lead you to believe. Because, again, the conventional narrative, there's a lot of people for one reason or another that are set on this idea that Kevin Porter Jr. is a bad apple. That's the Jonathan Givony quote, I believe, from the podcast. Well, he didn't directly say it about KPJ, but it was pretty clear what he was referring to when he referenced the Rockets and bad apples. And, you go back to the Chris Mannix podcast or column, whatever it was, waive him, cut him, eat the contract, all that stuff. And there's just a rep on KPJ that's out there. But when you look at the substance, to me, there's at least a case to have some optimism. And if you can potentially get KPJ to accept the right role, to me, what we've seen in recent games, it's really, really promising. Again, we can talk about the weekend, the super micro. We can talk about 46% from three over his last 7 games, or what I think is most telling, since Christmas, better than 60% true shooting percentage, better than 41% from 3 on 7+ attempts per game, high volume. He's making 80% of his free throws over that time. The turnovers are down to 2.4. Again, not trying to say for sure that Kevin Porter Jr. is a part of the future. Certainly having his contract as basically expiring every year is potentially useful filler in trades. Should also point out, by the way, hopefully he sits out one of these final 3 games, because if he misses one more game, his expected cap figure is going to be about $2.5 million lower. Would not mean any less value for Kevin, just in terms of what it would be on the Rockets books or in trades. So that could potentially have relevance as well. We'll see if the Rockets take advantage of that over these final 3 games. Stay tuned. But to look at it more broadly, I just find myself really, really hoping that Kevin Porter Jr. is amenable to accepting a slightly different or a modified role, because to me, there's a lot to like about what we've seen from him these last couple of months. Well, when he's been out on the floor, that is.
Even so I'm a big KPJ fan. I've grown kind of saturated of all the mistakes that he's done. Not off the court, I mean the on the court mistakes, as far as pace, as far as the lackadaisical attitude that he has at times. But he is one of the guys that's the easiest to root for to succeed in this league. And so I had not noticed that he's been playing this well, and I think a lot of people haven't noticed, because it usually we've just grown accustomed to, usually KPJ will have these 2 or 3 game stretches where he's really good, and then he'll be really bad for 10, and then he'll be really good again for 3 or 4. And so we've kind of discarded these games as the 3 or 4, and well, it's actually been 26 games, and 41% from 3 on 7 attempts is insane, and 80% from the line, especially for him, is insane. And that's a huge jump. I had not noticed, he's at 78.4% from the free throw line this season.
Yep.
He was struggling from the free throw line, borderline 70s earlier in his career. I can actually just check it. He was 64% last year was one of my biggest pet peeves with him. I've made this point before. If he can take on a 6-man role, he can literally be a perennial 6-man of the year contender. He can still play his 20 minutes a game. He can still play the role Eric Gordon played when our 2-star players were guards. Eric Gordon, very much like KPJ, was a 6-man that was able to come off the bench, lead the second unit when you don't stagger them, or be the second guy when you do stagger them, and at the same time play the 3 because he has the size to do so.
And by the way, one
Yeah,
quick interjection. I mentioned the Jamal Crawford comp earlier. That's someone that really jumps off the page to me as a potential KPJ parallel. You know where Jamal Crawford is from? He's one of those Seattle guys that I know KPJ respects and has something of a relationship with. Maybe that's something as well, that he's seen someone with a very similar archetype that I think he knows and has a positive relationship with on a personal level
he
that has
does.
had success in that role.
Yeah, he does. He's always on the J crossover tournament in the offseason.
Good point.
But yeah, if he can, and I've made this point before, not only will he go from an under-talented playmaker for the point guard role, he'll be very much over-talented for the backup point guard role. Because he won't be facing defenses nearly as fierce. He'll be mostly facing second units. He'll be, I think, on most second units in the league, he's clearly the best player on the floor. And at the same time, his contract now becomes a bargain. Because you don't pay what I think would be one of the best 6-men in the league. You don't pay him 15 through 18 million, depending on what objectives he can accomplish. They're worth way more. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but Eric Gordon was making what, 16 million? Like 5 years ago when the cap was 30 million lower? It's pretty insane. We just need him to be willing to take that role. And I think, as you said, with James Harden, I think he takes it. With Scoot, which is one of the biggest scenarios, it's going to be tough, especially if Scoot comes in. They just give him the point guard role off the rip, and Scoot comes in and disappoints early on, which is likely because he's a rookie, and that usually happens efficiency-wise.
Yeah.
So it's tough when you're trying to win to tell KPJ, hey, this guy's a worse player than you, but he has more potential or whatever. Because every player thinks that they have the highest potential in the world. So it's tough to do, especially if you're trying to win to manage that dynamic. But hey, it's not been just a 2-3 game stretch where KPJ looks awesome. It's been a very long stretch, and more than anything, I'd love to have him stay. I just love him as a person. I love the growth that he's shown.
It'd be a great story on both a professional and personal level if they can pull it off.
Yeah, and I think that's the type of guys that you want to keep, guys that have been here. He is the guy that's been here since the beginning, other than KJ Martin, that I would probably project, if he plays well, to be here when we're actually contending. Just all respect to Jay Sean, but if you can't shoot stuff to make a team when it has this much talent. But there's one more thing after KPJ that I forgot to mention that I wanted to bring up. And it's kind of not on a sadder note, but it's not something positive either. And if I say it and you go back and watch the games, it's very, very noticeable. And when I started thinking about it, I actually went and watched some of the games, and you can see as the play is unfolding that this happens a lot. Alperen Sengun last year, and I know I've been labeled an Alperen Sengun hater. This is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a trend. Last year, he would kick out to shooters a lot more. And I don't know if it's because he has lost trust. I mean, we are one of the worst shooting teams in the league, if not the worst.
For sure.
But it feels like he's always trying to go for the cutter, even when the window's not open, and he's forcing that pass a lot of the time, which leads to turnovers, which leads to, tipped balls or out of bounds, whatever might happen out of those plays. That needs to correct itself, because there was a very clear play that I noticed in last night's game where Jalen was wide open. Sengun had the ball in the post. KJ Martin's cutting as a decoy. He's drawn. There's, I think, 3 guys in the paint. KJ Martin has drawn the 3rd guy into the paint. Jalen is wide open. And Sengun looks at Jalen, does not pass the ball to him, and tries to threaten it to KJ Martin, who I think bobbles it, going up for the dunk. I understand that a lot of our guys play for stats. And this is somewhat also playing for stats, because a layup on this team, it's probably more of a guaranteed assist than a 3-point shot is, even if the shot value is not the same, especially if it's a contested layup. It's not a huge worry, but it is a trend that Şengün has, gone for the home run play a lot more often than he was going last season. He was a lot more willing to, and I've not got the stats, and I'm sure if you go look at the stats, it will back what I'm saying, not only because of what I'm saying, but also because we don't run the dribble handoffs that we run at the top of the key don't result in 3-point shots nearly as much from the eye test as they did last season with Garrison Matthews, Armani Brooks, and DJ Augustine playing, being the main ball handlers when he was playing. But it's definitely a trend, and it's definitely something that I'd like to see change. And maybe it will, just by virtue of getting better shooters and Şengün being able to trust that the shooter is going to knock down the shot before passing it to him.
That's if he sticks around, of course. Really going into this offseason, there's so many potential roster configurations based on the salary cap room that they're going to have, the incentive to win. Definitely possible that Şengün is one of those young guys. Really, almost anyone could be, in my opinion, other than maybe Jalen Green, a trade candidate as the Rockets try and get more veteran help to try and pivot to winning a lot more in the short term. We know the draft pick obligations to Oklahoma City that start back next season. That, of course, is from the Russell Westbrook, Chris Paul trade from back in the day. But yeah, if Şengün sticks around, I think that's the hope, is that he trusts the shooters a bit more once they actually upgrade the team in that area. And there's someone other than Kevin Porter Jr. they can regularly trust to make those catch and shoots. So I promised a negative trend. I mentioned that I had two that I was watching over these last few games, and KPJ is definitely the positive one. The negative one that I want to touch on, and I'm not trying to throw him under the bus. He's had a very unfair hand dealt to him, but Stephen Silas. The reason I feel
I like this.
The reason I feel compelled to revisit the Silas angle, when the Rockets had that stretch in mid-March where they had won 5 of 8, 3 in a row, we talked about, look, what if over these last 20 games they were something, they ended up winning like at least 500 or above that? Is there something that they could do to really change the narrative on Steven and make it clear that he was worth keeping around? We know, and we've talked about ad nauseum in the past, the reasons why the bar is very high for Steven to keep his job. It's nothing personal. It's just there's no future money guaranteed to him. So it's a pretty easy time to pivot if you want to do so. And with some of the things that have been said the last few months, it feels like, about this franchise, bringing in more of a proven coach is an easy way to upgrade your reputation, your credibility, heading into a summer that you expect to be very active on the market. You have about $60 million, give or take, in cap space, and so on and so forth. So the bar for Steven, even though he's well liked by his players and really everyone in the building at Toyota Center, the bar is just very, very high for him to keep his job. Yet, if they finish the season really, really strong, and all of your young guys were showing improvements, say what you will, but Jalen Green definitely got better in his rookie season. He's gotten better in year 2. Jabari Smith Jr. has finally showed signs the last few weeks that even if the shooting still isn't where you'd love it to be, it's better. If you squint hard enough, you can definitely find positives up and down the roster. You mentioned Tari Eason, certainly all-purpose. Şengün has had a big year in his second season. Silas mentioned after the Lakers game that he's taken on a lot more responsibility defensively after being challenged on that end, that he likes the effort, the confidence that All-P plays with. It's not as if there's no positives. And so when the team had that uptick, even with the reasons to consider bringing in a name coach, I do think that while unlikely, there was at least a path where you could make a case for keeping Steven. At this point, with only 3 games left, and with the defense, as we talked about leading off this segment, clearly regressing over the last few weeks. Some of it's schedule related. They had the tough 5-game road trip, all against contenders. But the bottom line, it's a results business, and they've now lost 8 of their last 9 games. And whatever vibes they had from the 3-game winning streak, the 5 of 8 stretch, that's not the current group. I'm not going to say that they're the same team they were at the end of February when it was just a tire fire, a disaster. But I do think there's clearly been regression, and it's the type of regression that, to me, you're not going to say that it undoes all the progress, but it makes that scenario we talked about in March of, what if they finish the season really strong? Is there a way that Steven can leave the impression with Rafael Stone, Tillman Fertitta, the entire front office and ownership, that they've got something, that they're building something that if you take out the head coach, there's a significant risk. To me, this recent stretch, not going to say that it's terrible, it's awful. No, a lot of this is standard young team stuff. And again, the job changed dramatically from when Steven was hired in November of 2020 and James Harden and Russell Westbrook were still on the roster. A lot of this isn't his fault. He's inherited a ton of baggage, a lot of bad stuff. He's a great guy. He works hard. All those things are completely true. But the reason going into this whole process that we were always skeptical that Steven would keep his job after the year is just a combination of a couple of very simple things. He's not owed any money after this season, according to reports, which makes it a very easy time to pivot if you want. And with the Rockets expecting to be so active this summer, coach is a very easy position to upgrade and potentially make yourself appear more credible on the market. So because of that, even though it's not entirely fair, the bar was very high, in my opinion, for Steven to keep his job. That's always been my read on this. And the last couple of weeks, while it's not a tire fire, it's not an embarrassment. The schedule for the most part has been harder. All that stuff is true. I do think that it's fair to say the Rockets have not reached that bar to where Steven's saying is a very likely scenario. So I would just say, to sort of close the loop on the discussion we had a few weeks ago, enough of the sample has played itself out. At this point, I don't think it matters what happens over the last 3 games. The die is cast with this group, and I just don't think their finish is going to be nearly enough to where I suppose the continuity advantage, the chemistry, whatever you want to call it, of keeping Steven offsets the upside of what you could potentially do by bringing in more of a name, be it Nick Nurse, Ime Udoka, Frank Vogel. We mentioned some of the possibilities off the top. Regardless, I just think this last regression, it's not something that in a vacuum should cost Steven his job, but I think this last stretch of the last couple of weeks, it probably was the last realistic chance he had to keep it. And at this point, it feels like the die is cast. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on and on again about all of the reasons Stephen South should not be our head coach next year. From culture to on the court to just his press conferences to I'll just touch on 2 of them. I mean, and this is a point I think Firebear on Twitter, no, Nathan Fogg made on Twitter about how a lot of people say that a lot of people discount the share of the blame that Salas has in this by saying, "Oh, Stone is asking him to lose." But one of the principles when you're losing is you want to get as many data points as you can on different skills that or where your players are at different skills in their game. And the truth is, for a team that's as bad as we are, we changed very little across the entire season. We don't try a lot of stuff. It's not a new thing. Last year it was the same thing. How long did we have to wait until Christian Wood and Alperen Sengun played together? We barely got any games with that. This season, the entire thing that he mentioned that Coach Mahmoud Abdel Fattah mentioned
Right.
the pick and
The
roll stuff
Jalen
between
KPJ 1 and 2. Yeah. The 1-2 pick and roll.
And how he had been sitting on that for a while, just that never, gone around to trying it. It's like the second worst team in the league. We can't say the worst team in the league anymore, but you're the second worst team in the league, or the worst team over the last 3 years. You should be proactively trying new stuff, unless your goal every game is to go out there and win. And so, and if your goal is to go out there every game and win, then you're doing a terrible job, right? And I'm not just saying just the young talent or the fact that it is young talent, meaning that it's harder to put out a winning product. I'm not saying that at all. I think that's completely fair. At the same time, you got to do better than whatever Dacian Nix is doing out there. You got to do better than 5-in lineups. You got to do better than just playing drop with small ball 5s. You got to do better than at a lot of these things. So, but the entire overhelping stuff that we saw the entire season, although I'm fairly certain that was just Lionel Hollins, or Lionel Hollins's Yeah,
By the way, speaking of backup point guard, shout out to Ty Washington for leading the Rio Grande Valley Vipers, the G League, to the G League Finals, which start
for
this week.
sure. Yeah, for sure. So I think, and hopefully they win. That's back to back. They won it last year.
Yep.
And that's a perfect segue. So for me, um, I didn't think he had a real chance at clawing his way back to coaching next year for the Rockets, unless something terrible happened and we lost out on basically every single head coach
Yeah.
that we wanted. Maybe if that's the case, you delay it by a year because you can't sign a guy just for 1 year. In that case, it just gives us another year because he's already under contract. He has basically a non-guaranteed year. So to me, it wasn't really that he lost his last chance. It was just that we just reverted back to what has
Yeah.
been most of his tenure here, and so it kind of even makes the point stronger. That
Yeah.
being said, and speaking of the Vipers, we should probably talk about the rumors that have been going around about Nick Nurse.
Ooh,
And I,
yeah. And let me set this up. So the way I think this is going to work over the next weeks, the regular season ends on Sunday, and once that happens, the Rockets, like every team, the moment its regular season is closed or they're eliminated from the playoffs, play-in tournament, whatever it may be, they evaluate their leaders. And typically it's a rubber stamp because at the top of the organization, there's not a ton of turnover. Now, there was a report from Bill Simmons released earlier Monday that indicated that maybe Rafael Stone could be in trouble as well. It was just a by mention in the podcast, but in talking about Nurse and the Rockets, he mentioned not knowing who would be hiring Nurse because clearly that would be the GM's purview. Me personally, I'm still skeptical that the Rockets would do that. I'm certainly not going to rule it out, but everything that I've heard in the past is that Rafael is on relatively good footing. We've talked about his track record. We had an evaluation of Rafael Stone podcast in January, and we basically agreed that while not perfect, it's pretty good. There's a lot of risk of letting a GM go because you can definitely do worse. These guys typically are long haul hires. He hasn't really had a chance to see his vision through. And in my opinion, since then, his track record is actually strengthened because it looks like, and we're going to talk about the draft in just a few minutes, that the Eric Gordon trade at the deadline could be really, really nice, moving you from the end of the first round, the Milwaukee pick, to what's likely to be middle of the first round with the Clippers pick, could be as high as 13 or 14 even. Again, we'll get to that momentarily. But I think, first off will be making sure that Rafael is going to come back. And if for some reason the Fertittas want to move on from Rafael Stone, again, not anticipating it, but Bill Simmons seemed to be hinting at it. So let's at least acknowledge the possibility. Should that happen, and I think it's unlikely, you would have to resolve that, in my opinion, before you would have movement on the coaching front. Now, who knows? Maybe Steven would just want to part ways at that point and you could have some sort of mutual decision. But the bottom line is there's much more incentive to move quickly on the GM front because it's the GM in most cases who hires the coach. If you want to hire the right GM, you need to give him the ability to hire the coach he wants. And also the GM is much more heavily involved in the April through June period because that's when you're doing your draft scouting, getting ready for a draft in which the Rockets are going to have one pick high in the first round order and another in the middle. So if for some reason the Rockets were to move on from Rafael, which again, I am not anticipating, but if they were, you would have to do something really, really quickly to try and get the next guy in place because you're going to have to try and put back together your staff as quickly as possible because of all the decisions that are going to need to be made very quickly entering the off season. With head coach, honestly, you don't have to have a head coach until June or July in terms of the off season programs. I mean, your front office can handle that in terms of telling the players what to work on and staying in communication with them. Really, you're not going to do too much in terms of the head coach developing his plans for the next season until after the draft and free agency, and you get a much better handle on what your roster is going to look like anyway as you get closer to summer league and then some of your off-season workouts and so on and so forth. So the bottom line, the first domino that's got to fall is with Rafael and making sure that he's still the GM of this team, which I believe he will. Once that is decided, then yeah, next on the agenda is the resolution on the coaching front. And if Steven is not the guy, then my guess is you hear relatively early in the process. Again, you don't even have to fire him. You can just say mutually parting ways because his contract is basically up other than a team option, according to reports. If for some reason, again, Rafael isn't around, then maybe they punt that back a while because, again, you wouldn't want to force the hand of the next GM. You'd want to allow him to make the choice and maybe you push back your decision on Steven's team option a while you sort out that. But assuming what I consider the likely scenario of Rafael Stone sticking around, then my guess is you move on from Steven or make the decision on Steven. My guess is that it's moving on relatively early so that you can start the process of interviewing and basically get a head start, because some teams, of course, that enter the market may enter late because they're in the play-in mix or the playoffs or whatever it may be. So if you're the Rockets, you want to use time to your advantage. If nothing else, interview a lot of guys so you can pick their brains and learn more about their philosophies and so on and so forth, and perhaps set yourself up for your assistant pool as well. There's a ton of benefits from doing a thorough, comprehensive search, and that's what the Rockets did 3 years ago when Rafael Stone, we know, led the search. It's been reported that even though Gerald Morey was still technically the GM, internally the Rockets knew he was on his way out. So Rafael led the search that ultimately had 3 finalists: Jeff Van Gundy, Stephen Silas, John Lucas, and it led, of course, to Stephen Silas getting the job and John Lucas being the lead assistant. Again, that goes into the fact that some of your search may also influence what your staff as a whole ends up being. So to circle back to Paolo's lead in, I know I was long-winded with that, but come on, you guys know me by now. That's who I am. With regards to Nurse specifically, there's been some talk of the circumstances that are leading to his what appears to be exit from Toronto. Why did the guy who won the NBA championship in 2019 fall out of favor so quickly? Why did the team seem to be unresponsive to him? And my general response to that is that with a few exceptions, guys like Greg Popovich, Phil Jackson, Red Auerbach, for the most part throughout the NBA, head coaches are situational. They're complicated puzzle pieces, and you're just trying to find the right fit at the right time. I would not take too seriously any analysis of why did so-and-so, be it Nurse with the Raptors, Frank Vogel with the Lakers, perhaps Udoka with the Celtics is a bit different because there's some extracurricular stuff there that you would have to consider. But in terms of the basketball, look, these things typically have a very short shelf life. And in the case of the Raptors, look, it's a veteran-laden team that once they lost Kawhi, they're in that good but not great tier. How did they get to the next level? And it's just felt like to some extent they've been spinning their wheels ever since. And there's a combination of two things that can happen. Number one, once the team starts to sense that, you can certainly start to tune out the leadership that starts to sort of shrug your shoulders and here we go again. And also, just from an organizational perspective, look, when you're in that position where you're capped out, you don't have a ton of trade assets, the easiest thing to change is the coach. Because as we've talked about many times, there's no salary cap on coaching hires. That's the one thing that you can sort of easily try to change the mix to see if you can salvage it. So when we look at these situations and say, why did Nurse not work out with the Raptors? Or why did, Vogel and the Lakers, or any coach for that matter? And by the way, it's so weird to say not work out when, again, we're talking about guys that won the NBA title in 2019 and 2020 when we talk about Nick Nurse and Frank Vogel. But the bottom line is coaching for the most part is situational. I think everyone would agree that Mike D'Antoni, as an example, was a great hire by the Rockets in 2016. And yet there was a large segment of the Rockets fan base that was ready for him to move on in 2020 because it just felt like it had run its course and the Rockets needed to try something different. Even if it wasn't necessarily Mike's fault, it just felt like that they had tried everything they could possibly do with the D'Antoni regime, that system, and they needed to do something different. And so even aside from the money, even aside from the rebuilding factors, because the time they moved on from Mike, James Harden was still on the roster and they're still trying to make it work with them. A lot of people wanted to move on simply for basketball reasons. And this tends to happen. So I would just say, as my, primer for going into coaching season, if the Rockets go down that road, and, again, we've heard names like Udoka, Nick Nurse, Kenny Atkinson thrown out there. Who was it? It was, Lance Erline and John Granato of ESPN 975. I've heard in the past that Granato has a good relationship with Tillman Fertitta, so consider that as the potential source of rumors. There was also a leak that Jaylen Brown could figure into the Rockets' plans. We'll talk about that more in a few days when we have our CBA episode, because the new CBA could potentially impact that pursuit and what makes sense for the Rockets and Celtics and what doesn't. Again, stay tuned for that over the coming days. But just my general thoughts leading into a coaching search. Don't weight too heavily this idea of, well, it's a retread who didn't work out at his last stop. They didn't want to keep him around, so why would he work out here? No, the odds are it's not going to work out anywhere. Again, it's so tough to win a damn title. And then even if you do, the way the Raptors and Lakers did, things can turn south. You're basically looking in most cases, unless you get a Popovich or a Phil Jackson, which is incredibly unlikely, you're looking for a temporary Band-Aid. You're looking for someone that come along at the right point to be the right guy for 4 or 5 years, and then anything beyond that is a bonus. So again, do not get bogged down on the exact circumstances of why did this guy not work out, because 90% of these coaches aren't going to work out if that's your standard. Situations change, and the coach is always the easiest piece on the chessboard to change. Look at what's happening now with the Rockets and Steven Silas. Again, I've made clear that I don't think it's all Steven Silas's fault. I think there's a world in which Steven Silas could eventually be a good NBA coach. It's absolutely possible. It's just so happens that he is a very easy position to change entering a summer that the Rockets have all this cap room and need to sort of restore their reputation. So this is probably the right time to move on. So when it comes to Nurse, who I like because of his structure, his attention to detail defensively, I think that's something that clearly the accountability, the discipline, those are themes that this team would benefit from, especially as young as they are with these prospects. I think Atkinson, Udoka, Frank Vogel, they have their positives. I would just say, broadly speaking, don't hold their past against them. Unless it's something off the charts bad, that's the way it works out for 95% of coaching hires. And again, to use Mike D'Antoni as an example, many of them can be very, very good. So when you evaluate these coaches, don't go just by the end. Go by the entirety of their tenures. Because if you could just find someone that's a good fit for 3, 4, 5 years, I think Rafael Stone would take that and run with it, right?
So I'd actually like to make the case for Nick Nurse, because he's actually probably my favorite guy. But first, to touch on what you just said, it is important to realize that head coaches don't work out forever anywhere. And if your standard for a head coach is not going to work out here is what he has done with his previous team in the last 2 years or whatever, if that's the standard that you're setting, let's look at the list of NBA coaches right now. Everybody remembers what J.B. Bickerstaff was before Cleveland, and look, he took a really
good point.
Project team. Nobody had Cleveland making the jump that they did. He came in with a very different system from anybody else, running 2 bigs. They're one of the most promising young teams in the league. Quinn Snyder was with the Jazz for a long time and looked like one of those franchise coaches that maybe the closest you'll get to a Popovich type or an Eric Spoelstra type. And look, they haven't been that impressive. They're basically a 500 team with him there, with a very talented young team. Most of the guys that we can look at, look at the Sixers and Doc Rivers. Look at Monty Williams with the Suns. Well, early in his tenure with the Suns, he was not all that, and then they turned it around. Tom Thibodeau was jobless for a while, and he was largely considered just an outdated head coach, and he has taken the Knicks and taken them to a level that most people would not imagine that they could reach with the talent that they have. And then, other than that, you either got established names like Greg Popovich, or you got guys that got their first chances at being head coaches with the teams they're at currently, and they nailed it, and it's worked out, right? I don't think the Rockets are in a position other than Mahmoud Abdel-Fattah to realistically go with another rookie head coach that you hardly haven't heard of, just because of what happened with Silas as a young team. You really need someone who's going to bring in structure
and the market credibility this summer for the free agency.
And I actually believe Mahmoud Abdel-Fattah because we saw what he did with the Vipers, and he strikes me as a lot more hard-nosed than what Silas is. That's great. That's a compliment. And so that's why you can't really hold the last job that the coaches did against them, because if they are currently available, it means that the other team didn't want them. Whoever you get, someone didn't want them before. That's why they are a free agent right now.
Right.
So you're not going to get someone in any case unless it's a one-off like Ime Udoka, because he had all of that weird stuff going on. You're not going to get a guy that's coming off 3 really successful years, right? Unless they just decide to leave, which as a head coach, how often does that really happen? So
Right.
usually if a team wants to keep you, you'll stay. But now on to Nick Nurse in specific. This is the guy that was an assistant with the Raptors for 5 years, and then promoted to head coach. In his first year, he wins an NBA championship. Yes, you can look at it and say, hey, that was Kawhi Leonard. Kawhi Leonard was, carrying that team to where they got, and that's why he won. So if you want to discredit somehow a championship winning head coach because of that, sure. The year after that, he actually improved without Kawhi. He actually improved the team's regular season record. They had a 73.6% win percentage. They went 53-19 in the first of the 72 game seasons because of COVID. That's got to be worth something. The year after that, another COVID year, they went 27-45, and it was that season where the Raptors reached the point in the season where they thought they had no chance, and they just tanked all the way down and got Scotty Barnes. For those who don't remember, so they tanked the year. The year after that, back to a 59% winning percentage season, 48 wins, so close to 50 wins, which is kind of the benchmark for a good season, right? And then this year they are a 500 team. Let's look at the difference between the 74% win percentage season and then the season where they tanked. They lost Marc Gasol, they lost Serge Ibaka, and they were replaced by Aaron Baines, who is not in the league anymore, and Chris Boucher, who, I mean, largely strikes me as one of those guys that just the Raptors front office who love switchability and long guys. They just saw, hey, this guy can shoot threes and he has the length to play center. Let's try to make him work. And I think once they lost Kawhi, they kind of tried to shift and to double down on that mold more and more, which led to Nick Nurse having to adapt his playing style and his coaching style to that. Earlier on, they had Marc Gasol and Serge Ibaka as their two bigs. Right, that's a big difference from those two to playing small ball five basically every time. Or the one guy that they had that wasn't a small ball five was just a replacement level center, if that, most of the time. I think. Listen, this is to me a tier one head coach. If you can get this, to me, this is a home run. I would not expect. This would be a pretty ideal scenario for me. Either him, Udoka, or Kenny Atkinson would be a pretty ideal scenario for me for the Rockets. First of all, there's a clear ties with him starting with the Vipers and eventually going as an assistant to the Raptors and then becoming head coach and everything. There's clear ties to Houston and the Vipers. The Vipers have produced, I think, Chris Finch, right, who's currently with the Timberwolves, who got a head coaching job. They produced Nick Nurse, an NBA championship winning coach. I think Mahmoud Abdel Fattah is a prime candidate to eventually be a head coach in the next few years. So it's a good coaching, it's not a school, but it's a good coaching tree. And now let's look at the team that the Rockets have. It's a young team that needs accountability and that needs, above all, to really try on defense every single game, because we've seen that when they try, they can actually be a near 500 team with their current offensive capabilities, which I would very much expect get better next season with an entire summer to work on.
Yeah.
It is a playoff proven head coach. He did win an NBA championship. He got to the second round the year before, and eventually, when he got to the playoffs again last year, he lost in the first round. Not really surprisingly, I think to the Sixers and Joel Embiid on a standout performance. But he is a 61% win rate coach in the playoffs, which is bumped up by Kawhi Leonard as well, but not so much since when they were NBA champions, they only had a 67% win rate, regardless. Well, now let's look at what Nick Nurse is as a head coach and why a lot of people are concerned that if he's the right fit or not. He is a very abrasive personality, which kind of explains why over a 10-year tenure with the same
Right. He's been
organization,
the first 5 years.
Yeah, but still 5 years of being a head coach with a very abrasive personality that's going to demand the best out of players every single day.
And
that's going to punish players when they don't play well and sit them. that type of personality is how you make enemies and how
Yeah,
you wear out
for sure.
your relationship with the players. You wanna
And to
you wanna
your
jump in?
No, I was just gonna say, in your point on 10 years, it was very interesting. The report in the Toronto media, in case anyone mentioned it, it was leaked from the Toronto Star that there were whispers of Nurse to the Rockets for some time, apparently from their side. That came out on Thursday. And then on Friday, I'm guessing he was asked about it in the pregame press conference, and Nurse had a very reflective answer about 10 years and basically hinting at many of these dynamics we've been laying out. It's a long time in one place for a lot of reasons. And he said, he would take some time after the season to sort of think about his next steps. So, spoiler alert, that makes it pretty clear that he's aware of these dynamics as well. And so, the Rockets scenario, again, like their season's going to end on Sunday, I expect relatively quickly. The Rockets decide one way or another if Steven's the guy. Last year, I was the person who actually asked for a fellow and got confirmation at the exit interviews the day after on Monday. Is Steven sticking around? And at that point, they said he is. If he's not, again, it behooves the Rockets and any team moving on from their coach to use as much time as possible to go through the list. With regards to the Raptors, even though they're struggling, as we're recording this Monday night, they are 39-39. That's good for the number 9 seed in the East. Almost impossible. In fact, yeah, they have clinched a spot in the playoff tournament because the next team out would be the Wizards, who are 5 games back, and again, there's only 3 or 4 to play. So the point is, the Raptors are going to be in the play-in tournament. So any resolution on them, even if they don't make the playoffs, which at this point I think most people see them as a tier behind, certainly the Heat in the 7 spot and probably the Hawks at 8 as well. Although we'll see if the Raptors can get home court over Atlanta, then Toronto can be a very tough place to play in a single game elimination spot. So if it's the play-in tournament, resolution on the Nurse front could come at the end of next week if they make the playoffs. Of course, they'd be heavy underdogs to most likely top-seeded Milwaukee, but at that point you'd be stalling it out for another week or two beyond that. So just had to interject with the timeline. If Nurse is available, it could take a little bit longer. So just keep in mind that because the Raptors are not going to be eliminated after this weekend, it's not as if he would interview with the Rockets super quickly. They've got to finish out their season in Toronto first.
Yeah, and I don't think so. Depending on how it shakes out between them and Atlanta, if they actually get 9th, they are 1 game away from elimination for the season 2 times in a row. Because they play the first game against Chicago, and the winner of that plays the loser of Miami versus Atlanta. That's how the play-in works. We'll get into that when we talk about the Clippers pick. But likely,
yeah. But the first interviews would probably be the guys like Frank Vogel that are true free agents. So that would be the guys you interview first, and then the other guys you may have to wait a little bit longer if they're currently working.
Yeah, 100%. And so just coming back to Nurse's personality and the angle that, yes, right now the vibes out of Toronto is that the players are burned out on the coach, the coach burned out on the players. That type of coaching wears out players, as I was saying.
Yep.
At the same time, that's kind of what you need with the Rockets right now. And you can't look at a head coach as a 10-year plan. A head coach is a 4-year plan, sometimes 3 years, sometimes 5 years off the get-go. And for the next 3, let's do the average, let's call it 4 years. These are the years until Jalen Green's 25. This is the years until Jabari Smith-Jr. is 20, not even 23, actually, I think. These are the years where your draft pick will likely be a 19 or a 20-year-old. They'll go up to 24 as well. So these are formative years in a lot of your key players' careers. And at the same time, you want them to be formative years, and at the same time, you want to be competing. So you need someone to hold these guys accountable. I think Nick Nurse is actually the ideal guy. You could make the case that, and Nathan Falk on Twitter, shout out to him again, he made the case that when the Rockets were looking for a head coach and eventually landed with Mike D'Antoni, a lot of people believed that the Rockets needed a harsher head coach that would force them to play defense.
Yeah.
And eventually,
I saw that tweet. It was a great point.
Yeah, and Mike D'Antoni is basically the opposite of that, and I think it worked out pretty well. They didn't win a championship, right? But they maximized James Harden. They got as close as they possibly could have with probably the best team of all time. I argue that this is a very different scenario. This is a lot more young players. These are, just a completely different type of team. You're not trying to maximize one guy, so you get an offensive guru that's basically tailor-made to fit that guy. You're taking more of a team approach, and so you get less to one member, and so even if that guy eventually comes back, which would be funny, you're taking more of a team approach. And from a team approach, you want every guy to be bought in, and you want to build a cohesive unit. And I think Nurse can do that. And then Also, looking at the personnel itself, right? As the years have gone on, some players have taken a step up. Siakam has taken a step up. Fred VanVleet has taken a step up from creation duties. At the same time, you could never, since Kawhi left, look at the Raptors, or let's call it since Lowry fell off and eventually left. You could never look at the Raptors and say, "Hey, this is a team that has a lot of offensive firepower." They tried to. They had Siakam, which is a great player. Van Vliet is largely a shooter. They don't get in. He's
Right.
not a blow by your man type of guy. And then they tried to make OG Anunoby a 3-and-D wing, one of the best in the league. They tried to make him into a shot creator, and they constantly try to make these long wings, switchable wings, into shot creators because that's their end goal. If they can achieve the ultimate switchable defense, they're going to need some of those guys to become shot creators. And so a lot of it is forcing a larger role into OG Anunoby. And if you watch the Raptors play, a lot of the time they just struggle with dribble penetration. It's what you typically see when the team doesn't have one great shot creator other than Siakam and Siakam is a post playmaker for the most part, and so it's even harder when you don't have a star guard. You a lot of times see exactly this. We saw with the Celtics as well. With the Celtics as well, it largely develops into a perimeter game, shooting over guys, weird post ups, fadeaways, that type of stuff. So it's not like he had a roster, while it is a good roster, a roster that you can, with a lot of flexibility offensively, that you can, play a typical NBA offense through. And so we haven't quite seen ever since Kawhi left, even when Kawhi was there, we haven't quite seen the type of NBA offense that the Rockets probably are going to play, assuming they draft a guard or get one in free agency with Jalen Green, who is, rim pressure machine. Um, it's not like he had the best conditions, and he was trying to make the best out of this philosophy that Devernovis had about the switchability, about everything like that. And so I think coming in, that's why he's my favorite candidate, because he has managed to adapt to all of that. He is that hard-nosed type of coach, and we have a lot of players with the physical tools to play great defense who just don't because they are not held accountable. And some of it, part of it, of course, is a skill issue, but if you can get these guys to try on defense every single night, that alone, I think, increases your win total by 15 wins. And this is not accounting, not 15, I'm not going to call it 15 wins because that's kind of well. I'll say 10 wins, and that's
Okay,
still
that's better. Yeah, I was like
yeah,
15. Holy shit, dude.
15 is really high. But a 10, I think you can get a 10-win improvement with the current guys just by forcing them to play defense every night, and by holding them accountable, subbing them out if need be. You might lose a couple of games because you subbed them out, but set that culture. I think you can get there, and then you add onto that whatever trades they make. You add onto that whoever they draft. You add onto that potentially James Harden free agency or whatever it is that you do with the cap space. And I truly think that you can make a big turnaround and become a play-in team because basically at that point you're getting a tier 1 head coach, in my opinion. You're getting a top draft pick, top 2 or not, still a very high draft pick. You have 60 million in cap space, so you have trade assets.
Yep.
You can make a huge turn
You can turn this
in your
quickly.
friend.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I think Nick Nurse is one of the best guys to do that. I also like Kenny Atkinson. Ime Udoka is scary because the Nets were like all in on him. All the
Right.
reports said that they were going to sign him, and then
backed out.
Yeah, like at the last step, which I guess was they found out what he actually did, and they thought, hey, yeah, we don't want to get into that. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Rockets did the same thing. So I like Nurse.
Although maybe there's a link between Udoka and Jaylen Brown to be determined. Obviously, that was his guy for a couple of years in Boston. We'll get into that more in the coming weeks. The bottom line, next week, we'll see what the Rockets do with Steven, and if somehow they keep him, of course, we'll talk about their reasons for that. And if they move on, then we'll look into these candidates, all of them, a bit more in depth, and we'll try and arrange some interviews with people who know them over their previous stops. Because, again, for a lot of reasons, it makes sense for the Rockets to look at guys with experience like Frank Vogel, like Nick Nurse, like Ime Udoka, like Kenny Atkinson, these names we've been talking about. And so we'll get into them more once the season ends on Sunday, and we see within the next 24, 48 hours, is my suspicion, if the Rockets are indeed going to be entering the head coaching market this offseason. Anyway, we'll save that for a few days. We'll come back to this, and perhaps the Jaylen Brown pursuit can be tied in with that as well for the reasons I was just saying. To wind down this episode, I want to talk about the end of the regular season and the final 6 days. Again, we're recording this Monday night. The entire NBA is off for the national championship game in college basketball. Starting Tuesday and going through Sunday, that's the last of the regular season. Every team has either 3 or 4 games left, 3 in the Rockets' case. Then next week, you have the play-in tournament in both the East and the West. And of course, the playoffs start next weekend on Saturday, half the games, and then the other half on Sunday. And of course, there's so many dominoes that will fall depending on how the regular season and when it finishes in terms of who's available and when they can start doing their interviews and so on and so forth. And the Rockets, it's going to be a busy offseason on a number of fronts for the reasons we've been discussing. But beyond coaches, beyond players, the Rockets also have the draft to consider, and they have both their own pick and, because of the aforementioned Eric Gordon trade, they're very likely to have the Clippers pick as well. It is top 4 protected, but the only way that would activate is if the Clippers end up missing the playoffs, which is possible, and then also having like the 2, 3, 4% shot activate of them actually winning one of the 4 lottery picks. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Should that happen, the Rockets would then get the Milwaukee first and a second-round pick from the Clippers as compensation. But again, extremely unlikely. There's also a very small chance that Brooklyn, they have yet to lock down a non-play-in spot. They're 2 games up, but they do have the tiebreaker on the Heat. Both teams have 4 games left. If somehow the Heat outplay the Nets by 3 games over these final 4, then that could send Brooklyn to the play-in tournament. And if they somehow lose there and miss the playoffs, then the Rockets have a pick swap right from the Harden trade. If somehow the Nets got one of the 4 lottery picks and were ahead of Houston, the Rockets could do that. But again, we need to wind this podcast down. There's way too much to discuss without going into like the 2 and 3% probabilities of if the Nets somehow miss the playoffs at this juncture and that swap activates, or the same thing with the Clippers. The Clippers miss the playoffs and somehow that, not the swap, the protection activates to where the swap is no longer applicable. Let's throw those to the wayside. Let's assume that the Rockets get the Clippers pick wherever it is, and that they do not use the swap right with the Nets. So they're going to have 2 picks in all likelihood, their own and one from the Clippers. Yes, there's a few other scenarios, but again, we're not trying to keep you here all night. As far as the Rockets pick, it's pretty simple. You focus on the win column with teams that are as bad as the Rockets because, again, they lose far more than they win. So the win column is what changes the least. At this point, Detroit's going to have the number 1 odds. And when I say number 1 odds, I mean the highest pick floor of number 5, because the 3 worst teams that the Rockets are locked into now, they all have the identical odds when it comes to those 4 lottery picks. So in terms of what the Pistons, currently the worst team, the Rockets, the second worst, and the Spurs, the third worst, are battling for, it's for the highest pick floor. Because again, the way this works is there's 4 picks determined by the lottery, and then after that, it's all by record. So if you don't win one of the lottery picks and you're the worst team, you can't fall lower than 5, as opposed to, if you're the 2 seed, you could fall to 6, because what if the top team, the worst team that is, also doesn't win a lottery pick? And then basically, you can always fall 4 slots lower based on the way the lottery is currently set up. So the Rockets, as of now, have a pick floor of number 6. Theoretically, if they somehow had the worst record, they could jump up to number 5. But again, 3 games of separation for the Rockets relative to the Pistons after winning that game on Friday. The Pistons have lost 9 games in a row. I just do not see any world where the Pistons, even first off, the Pistons would have to win 3 of their last 4 for this to even become a consideration. The Pistons would have to go 3-1, the Rockets 0-3, and that's just to force a tie and what I believe would be a coin flip. Bottom line, number 1, the Pistons have that basically locked up. Where there's a bit more intrigue is with the Rockets and the Spurs, because San Antonio has 20 wins, Houston has 19. That could be made up. However, the Rockets get a big gift from the Spurs when they beat Sacramento on Sunday, so there is that game of separation. And the Spurs have a home game coming up against Portland, a team that is clearly tanking and has been absolutely dreadful of late. So to put that in perspective, if the Rockets, if they finish 0-3, obviously the Spurs, you can't have negative wins. The Rockets would lock down that second slot, which means a floor of pick 6. But even if the Rockets win a game, let's say they go 1-2, for the Spurs to even tie them and force a coin flip for which team, they would have identical odds, of course, but which team has the higher floor, the Spurs would have to lose out, including at home against Portland, and they have 4 games left to play. So the bottom line is certainly from a draft perspective, sure, for the Rockets to lose, the Spurs to win, but the odds are heavily in the Rockets' favor of having that pick floor at number 6. I will say, just always keep in mind that when we talk about these pick floor scenarios, I mentioned this in our last pod, but it means there's a ton of chaos, because if the pick floor comes into play, it means that the other teams that are at the top of the lottery, they're not getting those lottery picks either. So you could have some crazy upheaval with teams from the middle to even high of the or back end of the lottery jumping up in that scenario, which would have all sorts of ripple effects. The more interesting takeaway, because there's just so many teams involved, and I know, Paolo, you've been tracking this, is with the Clippers pick, because they've lost 2 games in a row. All of a sudden, they are now tied with, 3 other teams. There's 4 teams in the West: New Orleans, the Lakers, the Clippers, and Warriors, all with 38 losses. And the Clippers only have the tiebreaker against the Lakers. Is that right? That's what I read earlier today.
So I'm not sure about the tiebreakers, but I think so.
Yeah, hold on 1 second. I'm gonna call this up because I think that's important to note, because the Clippers are at real risk of actually falling to the play-in tournament. Tomer Ozerly, who I respect them, yeah, they currently only hold a tiebreaker against the Lakers, and they have 3 games left. And they actually play the Lakers on Wednesday night, which is a massive game.
Can the tiebreaker change after that game? Do you know what the actual?
I'm not sure.
What it's
Yeah, I'm not sure, but the bottom line is they may not need the tiebreaker, because right now the Lakers and Clippers both have 38 losses. So it's possible that if the Lakers continue to take care of business and they look very good in Houston on Sunday, then they could put themselves a game clear of the Clippers if they beat them on Wednesday night.
I checked it. It's 3-0 for the Clippers right now. So even if they lose.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it will be second end of a back-to-back for the Lakers. That's the one downside. But again, they will be heavily incentivized to pursue that game, as they want to avoid the play-in tournament. Look, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about that Clippers pick when things were going well for them, potentially being 21, 22. Now we're starting to see some separation. The Nets, the Suns are at 35 losses. That's 3 games of separation relative to the Clippers. Miami's a game ahead of them now. The Clippers, as things currently stand, they're tied for the 18 spot with Golden State. But really, it's the loss column that matters with these teams that are in, the playoff race, because it's sort of the opposite. They win more than they lose, especially because they're incentivized to win this time of year. Look, they're basically a 4-way tie for the 16 spot with 38 losses. And then if you fall in the play-in tournament, and you don't win in the playoff tournament, the play-in tournament, that is, you could fall to 13 or 14, and the Rockets could have a second lottery pick. Again, yes, there's a small world where they could somehow win the lottery and keep the pick, but extraordinarily unlikely. Bottom line is, all of a sudden, that Clippers pick is looking real interesting. And the way I'll frame it, before turning things over to you to talk about the game analysis and what to watch for. I know some will say, look, it's the same general tier of prospects, whether you're at 18 or 14. A lot of the scouts say up until about 20, the prospects are sort of in the same general ballpark tier. The reason I think, first off, you certainly want to have your choice of guys with regards to who fits your system, who you like. There's always value in that. But I think especially for the Rockets situation this summer, because we know these picks, really not just the Clippers, but their own as well, could be trade assets. We know they want to get more veterans in, and so they're going to look to aggressively upgrade their team. You potentially have a lot more trade value if you're giving the team you're offering that pick to more options, that they can actually get their guy. There might be somebody that's willing to trade for that Clippers pick if it's at 15 and they can get a certain prospect they're really high on. But then if it's at 18 or 19, that guy isn't on the board, even if overall scouts see the 2 players as being fairly comparable and upside value, whatever you want to call it, that team may not see that guy as being a fit for them. And so all of a sudden the pick has a lot less value. The optionality of being higher, that means a lot in terms of the trade desirability. And for the Rockets, other than if they're in the top 1 to 3, depending on reports, those have been the numbers that I've seen, even their own pick, if it's at 4, 5, 6, 7, somewhere in that range, could be a trade commodity. You have to factor in what it looks like on the market as well. And so that's where having a higher floor and then bumping that Clippers pick up to where you're all of a sudden in the middle of that 10 to 20 range, and you're giving the team acquiring it a lot more options. That's where it's really important to the Rockets. It's not just about who the Rockets get. It's also about what that higher Clippers pick could mean for the market desirability as the Rockets consider their trade options.
Yeah, a good example of what you just said about the later pick, about 15 versus, I don't know, 18 or 21, not looking like a great difference when you look at past drafts. but it actually mattering. I mean, it does look like a big difference, but some people say that the draft is just a crapshoot anyways. But on the trade market, it can matter a lot. And here's a prime example of that. Last year's draft, I liked Jalen Duren and I liked Mark Williams, two bigs, the only two bigs in the first round of the draft, basically. Yeah, I'm just double checking. Other than Walker Kessler, who was projected to go late first. The Rockets had pick 17. And I liked Tari Eason, of course, but other than him, I really liked getting one of those bigs, either Mark Williams or Jalen Duren, if they fell that far. Basically, going into it, I had no hope that either of those guys were going to make it. And why is that? Because when you looked at the draft order, the Charlotte Hornets had pick 13 and pick 15.
Yep.
And it was like, well, the Hornets don't have a big right now. They're playing Miles Plumlee, or not Miles Plumlee, the other one, Mason Plumlee.
Mason.
And they're totally going to grab one of these centers, and the other one's just gonna go to any other team because they're the only two first-round centers or lottery centers in this draft. And so the difference between pick 16, one after the Hornets, and pick 13, one before the Hornets, was massive if you wanted to get a center in the draft. And it's just two spots, but you never know until the tiers in the draft shake out closer to the draft. You never know where one of those situations is going to form, where there's a clear floor that a guy is not going to make it past, and it's clear as day that team's targeting that position, and there's not a lot of players that play that position. That's why sometimes people kind of joke about, it doesn't really matter that much, a couple of spots up and down. It can matter that much. If the Rockets wanted to draft a center, they would have had to make a deal with Cleveland to jump ahead of the Hornets. And for that reason, Cleveland probably held a very important draft pick that they ended up not trading, but the point remains. But moving on to the interesting stuff, at least for me, because
the mechanisms of how we get to those pick selections, i.e., what happens over this week, what to root for.
Exactly. So this is your guide about what to root for the last 3-4 games of the season. Since the Rockets are already bad and they likely sit KPT for the game, so they might sit other young guys. Who knows? Basically, the way it works, right, is right now there's 4 teams tied with 38 losses with the Clippers. The Lakers and the Pelicans have one less game played, and so they could be tied if they won that game, but we don't know if they've won that game yet. You basically want to root for Golden State, the Lakers, and New Orleans to win every game. You also want to root for the Clippers no matter what, especially no matter what you want them to lose. Now let's look at what the Clippers games look like. So until the end of the season, there's 3 more games. It's the Lakers, which is a key matchup because that's the team that they're competing with to go to get out of the play-in into the 6th seed or the 5th seed. That's going to decide a lot. And who wins that game, whoever loses that game will be a lot closer to the play-in or the 8th seed in the play-in than the other. And then the Clippers play Portland. Portland's going to 100% lose this game. You can throw at me that Minnesota. You could have said that about the Minnesota game that they won. Truth is, they had a game. They had two game advantage over the only close teams to them in the lottery race.
Well,
and it's only one.
And what are the odds of Lightning striking twice? Come on.
Yeah, but it's only one game now, so there's no way that they ever chance it to lose odds based on a meaningless regular season game at the end of a terrible season. So the Portland game's 100% to win. And then there's a big game, which is Phoenix Clippers. Phoenix is currently the 4th seed ahead of the Clippers. And this is where it gets tricky. Because theoretically, you'd want Phoenix to win all of their games because they're just 1 seed ahead of the Clippers. And you want to make sure that the Clippers don't have any chance at catching them. Actually, what I want Phoenix to actually lose a game. So they're within striking distance for Golden State and for the Clippers. So they come into the last game of the season when they play the Clippers.
Yep.
And they want to win that game.
They're incentivized.
They're incentivized. So that's one of the little quirks of it. The other few things that I wanted to mention is the lottery standings are not divided by conferences. It's a seeding of the entire NBA, which means teams like the Hawks, who are currently 500, who have only one more loss than the Clippers, and Miami, who has one less loss than the Clippers. We
Toronto
want
as
these,
well.
Toronto as well, that they're close. You want these teams to win, and it's not as obvious because when you look at the standings, they are on two different tables. But we want these teams to win. The other team we also want to win is Brooklyn, because we don't want that to be, if the Brooklyn wins one more game, then they're out of reach for the Clippers. So
Yeah.
we want to make sure that they stay ahead of the Clippers, because that's another extra higher spot that we'll pick in the draft. So as counterintuitive as it may sound, we actually want the Brooklyn Nets to win, because they're 2 games ahead of Miami, who was the first play-in team, and they have the tiebreaker. So it's basically guaranteed that they're not going to be in the play-in. So you might as well root for them to win and stay ahead of the Clippers.
If you want to really stretch it, by the way, Chicago and Minnesota are both at 40 losses. They're technically within 2 in the loss column of the Clippers. So you could cheer for them as well, because what's going to happen if the Clippers, the big domino, of course, is, are they in the playoffs guaranteed or in the top 6 of the West, or do they fall to the play-in tournament? Because if they're in the play-in tournament and ultimately they miss the playoffs, then certainly you're in the top 14 at that point. But also it's where you stack up relative to other teams in that top 14 that also lose in the play-in. And so that's where these out-of-conference teams you're talking about. And the good news is that the race out east, you mentioned the West teams, that's obvious. The East, Toronto, Atlanta, Chicago, they're also jumbled. They should be incentivized to win because they want theoretically to move up and have home court advantage. We talked about that with regards to the Nurse timeline earlier with the Raptors. If one or more of those teams can win their last 3 or 4 games and get a little bit of separation from 500, then maybe they can tie the Clippers or edge them out by a game. It's unlikely, but they are incentivized to win because it's so jumbled. And so the point I'm trying to make is keep your eyes peeled for those 3 Eastern Conference teams as well. Right now, they're all behind the Clippers, but they're close enough within a game or two that, especially if the Clippers run into trouble and they lose that Lakers game on Wednesday, which, as you mentioned, is the big domino, those Eastern Conference teams, any of them that make a bit of a push towards the home stretch, they could come into play as well.
Yeah, and as far as what you said about Chicago being somewhere close, yes, I would agree, but with one exception. Chicago's next game is against Atlanta. Atlanta is closer to the Clippers than Chicago,
Good catch.
so
Good
in
catch.
that one we want Chicago to lose. On the other ones, they can win.
Okay, good point.
Couple more things. We also want the OKC Thunder to get out of the plane if possible, or get out of the plane in the sense that go down to Dallas, who are 1 game behind them, and not be in the plane at all. Because there could be a scenario where in the play-in, OKC and the Clippers play each other, and that's terrible for the Rockets because you want them both out of the play-in because you get whatever the worst pick is out of those 2. So it's not just the Clippers being bad; it's OKC also being bad. And if for some reason they're both in the play-in, we have to root for a structure in the play-in where they don't play each other, and it's very likely that they won't, but they could, and that's also not an ideal scenario because that basically kills any chance of us getting a lottery pick out of it. And one last thing that a lot of people get confused: the way the lottery seeding works after the play-in is the play-in shakes out, even if the 9th or the 10th seed advance ahead of the 7th or the 8th seed going into the play-in. The way it works is that the teams that advance to the playoffs, they're cut off, right, in both conferences.
Yep.
You even if they're not the higher seeds, and then you take the teams that didn't make the playoffs, you put them all together and you reseed them, which means that in the play-in, theoretically, you want the team with the worst record to always win, because if they win, the teams that are going to be in the lottery are going to have the higher records, and so they're, even if one of them is the Clippers, that might bump the Clippers pick ahead even 1 more spot. And so, as I said, after the play-in's done, you look at the teams that didn't make the playoffs and they are reseeded in order. Doesn't matter what they had done what their seed was prior to the play-in. It's just a reseed based on record.
Yeah.
So that's basically it. Just root for the Clippers to lose. Root for the Warriors to win, which I know is painful. Root for the Lakers to win, which I know is painful. Root for the Pelicans to win, which is not so painful. And then on the East side, root for Toronto to win, root for Atlanta to win, root for Miami to win, and we'll root for Brooklyn to win. And there is a possibility, and that to me that's a huge tier gap in the draft. Just to touch a little bit on it. To me, if you're in a position to get a Cason Wallace, a Jet Howard, or a Derek Lively or a Jordan Hawkins, which are guys that, or even a Bryce Sensabaugh, to me, those guys are clear tier ahead of a lot of the guys that are really projects.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the line is basically at 16, 17. That's when you still have a chance of getting one of those guys. So if in the Clippers pick is currently 18, so if they could drop just a little bit further down, that would be perfect. But yeah, if you heading into these last few games, if you need something to watch out for and something to root for, since our games are meaningless, pay attention to that.
And a reminder that everything is locked after the play-in tournament. This is not the NFL where if a team advances in the playoffs, that it's then reseeded after each round. That's the way it works in the NFL, is that a team, if they get in the playoffs and let's say they make it to the Super Bowl, then even if their record is, say, 10-7, something mid, well, then they're going to be one of the last two teams who made it to the Super Bowl. No, the NBA, everything is locked after the play-in tournament. So you will know by the end of next week what that Clippers pick, well, most likely. Now, there could be a scenario where they have to do a coin flip. But the bottom line is it's not going to be dramatically impacted. You don't have to sweat bullets depending on the playoffs. This is all going to be determined by what happens over the next 6 days, the conclusion of the regular season, and then the play-in tournament. We'll see what happens with the Clippers and whether they're in that over the next 3 or 4 days. It's going to shake itself out very, very quickly. And in conclusion, to me, the two biggest games, and I'll tie it all together between both the Clippers pick and the Rockets, the two highest impact games that I see, certainly the Clippers and Lakers, because the Clippers losing that game would also benefit their closest competition and the Lakers and push them closer, the Clippers that is, to the play-in range. And then the following night, the Spurs hosting, well, it's in Austin, but they're hosting the Trailblazers. Because if the Spurs win that game, in my opinion, it's very difficult to see the Rockets winning 2 of their last 3 games. At that point, it's almost done that the Rockets would have a pick floor of 6. They would be in that second best odds slot entering the draft lottery. So to me, the two highest impact games, Clippers, Lakers, and then Spurs, Blazers the next night. That's Thursday night.
One more game, and if you want to look like a genius next to your friends and look like, 5-head, if the Suns win their next 2 games against San Antonio, which should be a pretty easy game, and against Denver, depends on if Jokic is playing or not. If that happens, Phoenix versus Lakers, those are 2 teams that you want to win. You want the Lakers to win that game.
Because to incentivize the Suns for the final.
To advantage both for the Lakers to win the game, and to incentivize Phoenix to compete in the last game against the Clippers.
Yep. Good point. All right, well, we'll wrap it there because this has been one of our longer episodes, even by our standards, but there's a lot to cover. We actually hadn't talked to you guys in a little over a week, so there's been a lot to discuss, both in terms of the micro and the macro, as the Rockets finish out their 22-23 regular season and then get ready for, obviously, the draft. We talked about the pick considerations as the season winds down and the NBA approaches its play-in tournament, both the Eastern Conference and the Western Conference, but also what the end of the season means for the Rockets and the coaching market, as they're going to have to make a decision relatively quickly about Steven Silas and whether he comes back for next season. And if not, and it sounds like both Paolo and myself are clearly of the belief that he's not, then the Rockets are going to have a lot of options as they enter the market, most likely next week. Anyway, stay tuned for that. When we talk a week or so from now, we'll have more on that topic. And when we return later this week, this should be an episode, or should be a week, where we have multiple episodes. We'll touch more on the NBA's new collective bargaining agreement and what some of those takeaways could be for the Rockets in particular. Again, we're working on a special guest to help break that down. Stay tuned. We're hoping to be back by the end of the week with something on that front, fingers crossed. But regardless, we'll certainly be back by this time a week from now, because when the season ends, there's going to be some dominoes that fall really quickly with the Rockets. And of course, we'll have you covered right here at the Logger Line where, again, we try to do the best we can every single week to provide coverage of this basketball team. That's only going to intensify entering the offseason because it's so pivotal on so many fronts for this franchise. Could have a coaching change. They're going to have another high draft pick. They should be heavily involved in big-time free agents, including a possible James Harden reunion. Could they make a trade push for Jaylen Brown of the Celtics? So many possibilities. Again, we'll have you covered. Stick with us at the Logger Line, and we'll go in depth on all of these possibilities over the coming weeks. If you want Houston Rockets coverage and analysis, that's what we'll have for you. So with those plugs complete, we will finally adjourn. For Paolo, I'm Ben. If you want more content before our next episode, as we were just discussing, the best place to get it is on Twitter. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. Paolo is on there at Paolo Alves NBA. You can also follow the show, The Logger Line, on Twitter, simply at The Logger Line. And you can find our link tree there, which has so many useful content sources, both our partners, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, Rockets Wire, but you can also find Apple, Google, Spotify, individual distributors as well, where you can listen to this podcast. And again, in regards to our sponsors, you can check out their content and show some appreciation. Tell them that the Logger Line sent you by, and hopefully that will help them continue to support us as we go through the offseason and hopefully into a new era of Houston Rockets basketball after all of these upcoming changes. Whew. We've gone on long enough, over an hour and a half, but hopefully it was good content for you guys. Finally, we'll break here. Again, for Paolo Alves, I'm Ben Dubose. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another episode of The Logger Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing.